Often in apologetics, we hear Catholics arguing against Protestants, saying that Protestants have a subjective position when it comes to interpreting Scripture and identifying doctrine, especially something that derives from the apostles. Catholics will criticize Protestantism and say that it's just entirely subjective. Oftentimes, Protestants will retort by saying, but you guys too, you Catholics are also subjective because you have to make a subjective decision to accept Catholicism. There's some truth to both positions. However, the way I would put it is, both positions begin with subjectivity, but one ends with an objective mechanism to arbitrate between theological disputes, and the other remains in a subjective position and is not able to objectively identify what is apostolic doctrine. Let me unpack that. Both, again, positions start with the subjective experience. Both Protestants and Catholics have to ask the question, well, I hear this message about Jesus. Am I going to accept it? Am I going to embrace this claim to the resurrection? Am I going to embrace this religion I hear about called Christianity? That's a subjective question, right? And one has to begin with a subjective experience when asking that. Am I going to personally assent to this by faith? So again, both positions start with a position of subjectivity. But here's the difference. The Catholic looks through history and subjectively determines that there is a church institution established by Christ, and this institution is able to bind the conscience of its members with the authority of Christ. And the Catholic makes a subjective decision to assent to this institution. Once they have assented to this institution, which a Catholic would claim there is plenty of historical evidence for, so there's a strong case for it, but once they give this subjective assent to the institution, now their conscience is bound to accept whatever that institution teaches in its teaching authority. And so now they end up in an objective position where they can identify what is apostolic doctrine because they had subjectively assented to an institution that can now objectively bind their conscience. One might say, but it all rests on this subjective assent. Sure, of course. We have to personally accept and assent to Christ's church, and we have to personally ask, do I assent to this teaching authority that claims to be established by Christ or not? We all have to have that answer that question, and we have to make a subjective decision there. That's not in dispute. The point, however, is if the Catholics are right in the historical attestation to this institution and that it has the backing of Christ, then they find themselves in a position where the Christian can identify what the apostolic faith is objectively, because they are able to rest in the teaching authority of the church that has the authority of Christ and the promise of Christ to its infallibility under certain conditions. Whereas the Protestant remains in this subjective state where they cannot objectively identify what is apostolic doctrine. They remain in this continuous position where they ultimately decide what is apostolic doctrine for themselves. Again, both positions have to have a subjective decision at some point. It's just that Catholics they don't end in the subjective experience, whereas Protestants remain in this subjective experience. The key here is, and it all hinges on, if there really is a difference here, as far as the truth of things. Obviously, there's a difference just objectively considered. But this all hinges on whether or not the magisterium and the teaching authority of the Catholic Church really does have divine backing, whether it really is an institution established by Christ. If it isn't, well, a Catholic may have an objective way to identify what they think is apostolic doctrine, but they're mistaken. Just as a Mormon may have an objective way to identify what is Mormon doctrine through their apostles, but they're mistaken about the foundation of their teaching authority. So yes, the Catholic position really ultimately hinges on whether or not the magisterium really is what it claims to be. And I would say if we do look, yes, subjectively, throughout history, I would say the Catholic magisterium has the strongest attestation compared to the paradigm that the Protestants put forward. So to summarize, again, there is a difference here. Both positions start out subjectively, but one ends up in an objective way to identify apostolic doctrine, whereas the other one remains in this subjective cycle. But the superiority of the Catholic claim ultimately hinges on the truthfulness of the claims that are made about the magisterium. And yes, we do have to subjectively consider those things for ourselves. And the way we do that is we look through church history and see, does the Catholic claim for the Catholic magisterium really have the kind of backing that is necessary for me to have moral certitude that it is a divine institution and I should assent to whatever it teaches, and I should allow it to bind my conscience. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Also check me out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology, or hit the join button here on YouTube to become a member. And either way, either platform, you'll get access to extra content. I just posted some stuff yesterday, in fact. So I'd appreciate the support if you are so inclined. That'll do it. Till next time. God bless.